going to, of course. So thanks everyone for coming to our VENN session. This is our VENN number 7, and our VENN stands for Virtual Education and Networking Nights, and the VENN sessions are really designed for peer-to-peer learning, and the City of New Westminster has been putting these on throughout the pandemic every second month. And just to announce that the one in January is on January 19th, and it's with Iva, and she will be providing some instruction on plain language. So I do want to acknowledge where we are right now. I think it's really important that we can do that. So the City of New Westminster recognizes and respects that the New Westminster is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Halkomelin speaking people. We acknowledge that colonialism has made invisible their histories and connections to the land. And as a city, we're learning and building relationships with the people whose lands we're on. And personally, I acknowledge my immense privilege as a settler on this land, and I commit to lifting up Indigenous voices. So today I'm excited to be introducing Alison Brewin, and Alison has been a absolute fantastic help to me as I got the program up and running. And we also have an educational bursary program as well, and that exists through Vantage Point. So if you are a New Westminster based society or charity, you are welcome to apply for an educational bursary to take additional workshops if the ones that in the VENN program aren't quite what you need. So Alison is a consultant and writer dedicated to lifting and amplifying BC's nonprofit sector, whether as an executive director at West Coast Leaf or planning and organizational development consultant, or an executive director at Vantage Point. Alison continues to provide leadership support to all kinds of nonprofit organizations. She's currently serving on the UBC Board of Governors. She teaches in SFU's nonprofit management program and is working on a book loosely entitled How Purpose-Driven Nonprofit Management Will Save the World. She mentioned to me earlier that she raised a pack of children. That's her words, not mine. And she has happily downsized now and lives in a fairly new condo, fortunately not at risk of flooding, with her partner and her dog. So thank you, Alison, so much for coming tonight, and I'll let you take it away.
My pleasure, Jen. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. I know some of you already, or know you through various networks and things, and really happy to be here. I'll start talking about board recruitment in a second, but I also just want to acknowledge I'm actually in the southeast corner of Vancouver, in the River District, which is now known as, and these were the shared territories of the Stolo. I'm looking over here to make sure I Tsleil-Waututh, Qayqayt, Kwantlen, Snohomitis, and Musqueam nations, and I'm just reminded every day when I walk my dog along the river just how blessed we are to be able to live in this space, even when it's mad at us, as it is right now with all the mudslides. But just how much we can learn from the leadership of our Indigenous nations, and those of us who are settlers. My family came to Canada many generations ago, something like 8 or 9 along one line. And we're active members in establishing the nation of Canada, and some of the more colonial systems that have also caused us a great deal of problem and deep pain. So I'm connected to lots of that stuff. And part of the reason I'm so dedicated to nonprofits is because I know that nonprofits are the ones who are working with communities in all kinds of ways, healing and prevention of isolation and all kinds of great things. So I'm passionate about all of you and what you do. So I'm going to start by talking about, I have developed for you a 10-step process, but it's probably, the reality is that all of you are so different, and you know, when we get a chance to talk, I hope you'll share some of the your own experiences in your own organization. But board recruitment, of course, is defined so much by who you are as an organization. So let me just do the technical piece of sharing my thing. So let's see, participants, can you see my screen now?
Yep, we can see your whole screen, and now we can see your presentation screen, so that's perfect.
Okay. So you can see the presentation side, right?
That's right.
Okay, cool. Okay, so welcome. So the first thing that I think it's really important to talk about before we get directly into board recruitment tasks is to talk a bit about what is a board and what is your board. And partly we need to talk about this because I don't know if any of you watch RuPaul, but he always says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anyone else? It's a really important concept. So as an organization, who are you? Take some time before you even start to try to recruit a board to understand that concept. But so one of the things, what are we talking about when we talk about a board? Well, the first thing we're talking about, obviously, as most of us know, it's a legal entity. So a board is created because of either the provincial or federal nonprofit act. Here it's called the Societies Act. It defines a board. And the concept is, the theory behind it is that because nonprofits have a tax benefit, they don't have to pay taxes on their surpluses, aka profits. They need somebody to consider the public interest and make sure that the organization is doing what it's supposed to do. But regardless of that legal concept, what it really is a group of individuals who are taking responsibility for an organization, its asset, and its purpose. And I emphasize its purpose because I think we drop that off often when we talk about boards. We think about the assets, and that takes the board down a kind of authority and control path that I don't think is working all that effectively for nonprofits. So I think we have to think about its purpose. So because really what a board is there for is to ensure that the assets are being used in a way that advances the purpose of the organization. So that's what a board is. But it's important to acknowledge that it's about taking responsibility. And that means there's legal liabilities, there's responsibility when things go wrong, like you lose staff for some reason, or your ED is having troubles, et cetera, et cetera. So you are taking responsibility. Yeah. And so what is a board? What is governance? Because board and governance are not the exact same thing. We often do interchange those two as if they are. But in fact, when we talk about governance, what we're talking about is the organization's decision-making structure. So how do you make decisions as a group, as a community, as a nation, is how we define governance. When it comes to nonprofits, it's setting up, it's a set of processes and principles that help a group manage itself. And it's a reflection of the organizational culture. So your governance may include, for some organizations, your senior staff team, or just your ED and the board, or you may not have any staff, and therefore all the decisions are made by board members, or you may engage and bring in volunteers and clients and other members to participate in decision making. You may have a number of different systems and principles that you follow before you make a decision, especially certain kinds of decisions. So governance is more than just the board, but the board is, of course, a key piece of that governance, and often you want to keep them in that governance role. And one of the things you've probably heard in other conversations about governance as well is the idea of the working board or the governance board / policy board. And that binary spectrum is true for organizations. So with your board, how actively involved are they in operational activities, and how much are they involved in just overarching more policy and strategic and governance kinds of thinking? So, but I think it's helpful to also think about the three different approaches to governance. Not different, because governance as leadership is purpose-driven, really. But mostly we see corporate boards that are fairly structured, fairly formal. We talk about those clear, strict divides between the board and the staff. Very much focused on oversight, with often some strategic planning or thinking in there as well. And they're focused on the concept of diversity. When we think about justice, equity, inclusion, which is increasingly a demand of the community on the part of all nonprofits, no matter what your purpose is. But when a corporate board will think and go very quickly more to the question of diversity, which has its role in JEDI and in inclusion, but it also can slide very quickly into, well, we have a lawyer and a doctor and fundraiser, and that makes us diverse, rather than getting to some of the underlying things there. So a purpose-driven board is a board that's focused specifically on the mission. It's very clear about the mission. It's about relationships. It's about collaborations. There are key policies in place, but it's not necessarily focused on always having perfect and pristine policies. But at the same time, you do need to have some policies in place to give some structure to things. The staff and board relationship might be a bit more fluid, but it's connected by shared values and a strong sense of that mission, as opposed to clear lines around us, them, who's who. And the focus in the JEDI universe for a purpose-driven board is often more around equity and inclusion. And inclusion is, in my mind, about ensuring that if we're here to serve a purpose, who are we including in that purpose? Who is able to access that? Who needs to access that? And are we actually being accessible? So a purpose-driven board, even if it's, I've had discussions, for example, with soccer clubs where they can't figure out why certain communities aren't joining their soccer club, only to discover when you dig in that the Chinese community started their own soccer club because they didn't feel welcome at the traditional soccer club. So diversity inclusion matters there too. So it doesn't matter what your purpose is, but the purpose focus helps clarify who should be involved. Anyway, and then the last concept I'll share with you before we dig into recruiting is the actually, that's not true. I have a couple more things to talk about before we get into the specific steps. But I really encourage people to think of governance as leadership, and therefore board members as part of a leadership, as opposed to, it just pulls it out a little bit so that you talk about oversight and insight and foresight. So a board that is providing leadership is thinking about strategic things. It's thinking about the individuals on the board can provide their own insight, not that that necessarily is going to drive the decision, but as a group of people who represent the interests of the organization and the purpose, that kind of thing. There's a shared governance concept that it works well. There's an interplay between the ED senior staff and the board. And it isn't about ego necessarily, but it's about, everyone has ego, but it's about your lived and professional experience. And the focus is broader than just equity and inclusion and diversity. It's around justice, and it's deeper and allows people to really apply their values. So those are just some of my little rants about boards. And then just a quick question again on the why do we have volunteer boards? And you can pay your boards if your bylaws allow you to. It's not completely prohibited in law. It's frowned upon because there's really old ideas about community leaders, and that the people we want to recruit to our boards are frankly, in the old days, it was the successful businessman, most of the time, to be honest, or it was the wealthy housewife of the successful businessman. And to be honest, that still imbues a lot of our sort of policy and public policy around volunteer boards. Because when you start to get into equity and inclusion, you realize, well, if we're asking, this happened as women, working women started participating in that, they're like, well, I still have to get home to do childcare. So here's how these meetings have to go. We lose the leadership potential of all kinds of really amazing people out there that are leading in all kinds of ways. When we define community leaders that small. So paying your boards, I don't think paying board members is necessarily and automatically a bad thing to do. But you have to be very, very careful because legally the framework is designed that it's volunteers only. So the challenge and opportunity of the JEDI lens, that is really important thing for boards to consider around if you're looking for volunteers, what are you asking of people, and how can you support them to participate effectively? It's important to think that through. And then before we get going again, I just want to talk a little bit about succession planning, because I think board recruitment, a key part of it is both how you plan your succession planning and why succession planning matters, because the best place you're ever going to find board members are among people already connected to the organization in some way. And that will always be true. But what you don't want, I would say that. And I think if you've broadened out your idea of who makes a good board member beyond that kind of people who have already shown leadership, but people who are showing leadership within your organization already in different ways, or showing leadership in the area that you work in, the field you work in, that kind of thing, then it just starts to change the thing. So this map, this little thing I'm showing you here is just to say, who's aware of the organization? Ask yourselves that before you get into it, because if more people are aware of the organization, it's much easier to recruit board members, like way easier, because they know who you're talking about. They know what you do. They have a sense of who you are. So who's aware of the organization, and how can you build awareness so that it makes board recruitment easier? Who's benefited from the organization? Who benefits from the organization? That, I mean, obviously there's balances in that, and you've got to be thoughtful about engaging with, say, current clients of a social service agency, for example. But having said that, you know, arts organizations, your audience, for example, the people who love your art already, that's you right there. You've got a group of people to go to, artists themselves who, you know, want theater companies to continue to exist, for example. There's all kinds of people who benefit from the organization that you can consider. The staff members, who works for the organization. Now that's obviously awkward, and there's some people who feel like it's not appropriate to have staff members on your board as official voting board members. And again, a little bit like paying board members, that does depend on you as an organization. You can make the choice to have staff on, and some nonprofits do have staff members. But you do have to be thoughtful about how that plays out in terms of the importance of, when you're at the board table, you have to act in the interest of the organization, not your own interests. And obviously there's places where you might have to be involved in decisions that involve your own pay or your own benefits. You can't participate in that. But it's worth looking at who works for the organization and what's their relationship. In small towns, for example, you know, a theater company, again, I'll use that as an example, but you know, there might be a carpenter who shows up to help make sets every now and then, and you do pay the carpenter to make sets because they're the only carpenter in town who is able to make sets. And you recruit them to the board. And so if they continue to get paid by the organization to create sets, you've got to just create some firewalls and some systems around them to make that okay. But they might be a great person to have on the board. So, and then volunteers, key. If you don't have a volunteer program, then, you know, a good reason to start one is to engage people in the organization, not just to get help, but to have people contribute something other than money. And that can be all kinds of different volunteers, from professional experts to hands-on, you know, envelope stuffers. Not that we do that anymore, but, and then who contributes to the organization. Again, that's fraught a bit. Oops, sorry, I went too fast to the next one. So that too often that part, like you also same with who benefits and who works for the organization, you got to be a bit thoughtful about that, because where you might have a major donor on your board, they suddenly think that they should be able to tell the organization exactly what they do on an operational lens. And that's not always great. But at the same time, that person is an Uber supporter and is really dedicated to the mission and the organization. And so that's a good place to look. And when you have monthly donors, for example, that's an awesome place to look for potential board members and to put the word out. So yeah, so that's a few thoughts. And so I guess I've kind of talked about these people, but one of the things to think about or do you have committees as a board that other people, that non-board members can participate in? Because that's a great place to introduce people to your committee. So sometimes if you have a board committee or an organizational committee, say fundraising committee, do you recruit non-board members to that? Because sometimes it's a great entryway into the organization without making the full commitment of being a board member. So that's one thing to consider. Again, program volunteers, I think we've kind of talked about. Oh, another one is to your partner organizations. Who do you work with all the time? Go ask them if any of their staff might be interested in serving on your board. And that can be kind of a joint thing. So they're not staff of your organization, but they are working in a similar field. They're familiar with what you do. It's a great way to deepen that relationship. So think about who the community partner organizations are that you're often involved with and often partnering with, and look to them. And also a board member leaving one of those organizations might still want to be involved in a different way and thinks, oh, why don't I head over to that partner group? Again, that's circulating the same board members, but still, it's not a bad thing. Again, former staff, again, with a bit of a caution, donors and funders. Your funders sometimes, again, that's not always great, but in some situations it can work quite well, where you might be funded in part by some particular organization and they have staff members who are interested. I know that, Van City, for example, if they fund you over here on one side, doesn't mean like whoever, you might be able to recruit someone from Van City to be on your board who may have nothing to do with granting and your funding, but it's good to look at those kinds of institutions as well. And of course, members are a big one. And we'll talk a little bit about members later because they're very relevant. So the
Alison,
yeah.
there's a question. Amy's asked
Sure.
a question. I think there's a typo in it. So I invite you, Amy, if you like to unmute your mic, but she asks, on succession, do you refer on inviting the people that have knowledge of the organization, but how often the organization changes their board members?
Oh, when I'm talking about succession, I mean bringing in new board members and kind of creating a bit of a pipeline for board members. That's what I'm talking about when I say succession. In terms of limited terms for board members and board turnover, I mean, I do recommend that people set a maximum amount of time that someone can be on the board, because frankly, it's just good to have some flow of leadership in that way. And also it gives, so that's more what I meant there. And I mean, terms, I've seen organizations, depends so much on the kind of the nature of your work as to how long those board terms should be. But it's good to say, look at where maximum 6 years is very common, to sort of 3 terms of 2 years, and then staggering board members so that you're not recruiting the entire board each time. So what people do is they'll have, say you have 10 board members, they'll have half of them are on 1 year into their 2-year term, and the other half need to be reelected at the next AGM, and so that you always have at least 5 in place. So setting up that kind of a system, but that's more about board management per se than recruitment, except, well, it does come in because of course you don't want to set yourself up to have to recruit an entire board in one shot. And you need that kind of, it's good to have that consistency. But if you have some term limits, then it means you're bringing new leadership, new thoughts, new perspectives in. And I think that's a good thing.
Alison, since you're answering my questions, if that's all right, Jen, with you, the board members they have been with us since the beginning, which was the 2017, but we don't need to keep changing them, right? I mean, we can set that, we can decide that for what fits for us. Yes.
Yeah, you're not required
Okay.
to have a term. No.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
But believe me, 10 years from now, you'll wish you had a term.
Okay. Really? Okay.
Yeah. I know it feels right now like you can't bear the idea of any of them leaving because you're in startup mode. But down the road, you may want to consider it because I mean, I work a lot around nonprofit life cycles. And the thing is, if you're in startup mode, you want people dedicated, committed, engaged, and you don't want to lose any of them, and you don't want to have to go out and explain this new entity to anybody. So I totally get, Amy, why you would not want to, you'd want to have some stability right now and not go there. So there's no legal limitation there. So if you want to, you don't have to do that. It's kind of a good practice. But I do feel like,
actually, Alison, I'm actually planning now because they have been with us for quite some time, but the succession part of what my plan is to actually keeping them still involved, but now they take on the role as a mentor. So they're no longer part of the board, but now their role is the mentor to our new team.
Yeah, it's all kinds of great ways you can keep people engaged without, I mean, there's lots of roles, and that's one of those things around, if you have a committee, for example, that is supporting the organization and helping the organization do some of its work, that includes not just board and staff members, but also outside people. That's another place for retiring board members to continue to participate. I mean, at Vantage Point, for example, their finance committee is made up entirely of former treasurers. It's like 8 accountants. No, it's not that many. It's like 5 accountants. It's a lot of accountants. They're lovely. But they're all former accountants, former treasurers of the board. So, okay. So I'll keep going there. I see there's another question. Oh, former staff with the caution. Can you expand on that? Yeah, I think the caution with that is just that, you know, it depends a lot on the staff member, why they left, what their role was, what they're doing now, all that kind of stuff. But staff obviously have deep understanding of the organization. The challenge, the caution is that some either left because they wanted the organization to go in a certain direction and it didn't. And so they somehow get themselves on the board in order to take it in that direction, even though the organization is not planning to right now. And that can create a lot of conflict. And the other reason is if, you know, you really are trying to set a new direction and, you know, like former EDs, it's not uncommon for a founding ED to stick around and stay on the board, but that can cause problems too. I always think it's good to at least take a break and don't come back and join the board until you've kind of been away for a year or two and let the new ED settle in and kind of get things going. So I know I've gone back to West Coast Leaf as interim ED about 3 times. And the last time I did, I said I wasn't doing it again because things were starting to sort of head in different directions from when I had been more involved. And I was like, it's too much. I don't want to go there. I want to let you guys do your thing. So I should go away now. So yeah, but not everyone has that self-awareness. So, okay, so first step, who are you? So one of the things you really should get clear before you start recruiting board members, and again, depending on your organization, this could take like an hour of fiddling around with your files and things, but what is your constitutional purpose? Board members, it's kind of amazing how often board members are recruited and they have no idea what the actual legal purpose of the organization is. And if you find you've dug it up, most organizations in BC have a fairly refreshed constitutional purpose because we all went through the New Societies Act transition in 2016-ish, I think it was 15, 16. But having said that, if it's outdated, it's something you should work on. If you have charitable status, you got to be careful, but still, just what is your constitutional purpose? What kind of vision, mission do you have? If it's a formal statement, that's always great that everyone worked out together. Or do you have is your ED particularly good at articulating the vision of the organization and you want him or her to grab that and write it out for everybody so you all have it? There's ways you can, when you're recruiting board members, to kind of practice that vision, mission statement or the kind of tagline about who we are. And vision is about kind of the world we're trying to create. So that's like the inspiring statement of, we're here to ensure there are healthy children in BC. But the mission should describe kind of how you do it. So we do that by doing, educational workshops for parents or something like that. And then values and culture, kind of, do you all have a sense of that? And have you actually expressed it? And do you have some clarity on that? Do you have some kind of articulation of your strategic priorities and goals for the next period? Because part of recruiting good board members is recruiting people who can contribute to those strategic priorities. So if you've just defined your goals and one of them is something that's quite new to the organization, you really do want board members that reflect that and that can support that development. And a key part is, who are your members? Because you need to know who are your members, who needs to be at the AGM and vote properly. But who are your members and what are they about? And so going into that board culture of understanding, really it's digging up your constitution, your bylaws, any strategic plan you have, like just having a sense of that. And again, it depends on how formal or informal you are as to how much of that you'll have. The second thing is not just who are you, but what are you good at? Like, what makes you great? And there's the best thing you can do when you go out there to recruit board members is for all of you to be able to say, this is what's amazing about our organization. because that's going to attract people a lot more than, oh, well, it's, you know, we struggle with this and we never have enough of that. And we, you know, but what are you actually good at? What are you doing well? And one way to do that for the board is to look at a board matrix. And that's, you know, it's a, you can track down a board matrix online in all kinds of places. I'm pretty sure Vantage Point has one you can download, but it's just basically an outline of what are the skills and capacities and competencies, life experience, personal characteristics that we're looking for in our board. What do we need to have on our board to give leadership strength to the organization? What do we have? What are we missing? And then that helps define your goals. But it also gives you an opportunity to say to potential board members, well, you know what, we have someone on our board who's really strong in that area already, and we know that we're really good in that area, but what we're missing is, you know, blah blah blah. So it's really valuable tool for that idea. It's also good for you to remember a history of success. So, you know, obviously COVID has had a horrendous impact on so many of us, but it is valuable for people who are going out to recruit new board members to be able to talk about times that the struggles weren't as true and that you got past them. You know, obviously for a new organization, you don't have as much of that history, but what are the successes in the past? What are some of the secure, predictable revenue streams? Now, you may not have any, but what's the strength of your revenue? What does that mean in terms of the stressors that might be on a board member? So yeah, and then are there staff reputation or capacities that you can talk about when you talk to the board, potential board members about, well, you know, we've got this crackerjack program director who's like really got it figured out and it's very exciting, and or, you know, we're really excited about our ED and blah 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 or whatever. So thinking about that, and just, yeah, incredible awesomeness all around. What makes you amazing, and spend some time thinking about that and capturing that before you start recruiting. And then the next step is to think about the challenges. What are the challenges that are coming? And you know, are there some leadership transitions? Being honest about these things is important. I do know that one of the best board members I ever had was one who actually asked me outright, what's going to go wrong in the next couple of years? Because I like a challenge. Not everybody likes a challenge, but she did, and she was amazing. She really was great. But yeah, are there some expected leadership transitions, whether that's on the board level or the staff level? You know, what's your recovery look like for you? What are the challenges to kind of get through what's next in all of this crazy time we're in? Are there government changes that might impact you? Is there an election coming up that might have an impact? Is there something like that coming up, depending on, again, the kind of work you do and who you work with? That might be something that's relevant. Yeah, what are some of the trends in fundraising and in philanthropy? You know, there's a lot of discussion about philanthropy's looking itself in the belly button, as it were, and challenging itself around some of the assumptions it makes about charity and how to fund things. And so there's a lot of trends happening right now that I think are important to look at. And some of those might cause challenges. Interest rates are going up, which could be a good thing for those kinds of foundations like the Law Foundation and others that actually rely on interest rates. That might be a positive, but it might not be as well, because it can go the other way. So anyway, are there changing social and political values happening in the world? Yes, I think the answer would be yes. There's a lot of that happening right now. A lot of transition we're going through, and what does that mean for your organization in the future? And how do you want to communicate that to potential board members? Can't lose sight of the climate crisis, especially right now as our mountains are falling into our rivers and stuff. But what does that mean for you? I mean, immigrant serving organizations have to be ready for the migrant reality that's going to happen over the next 20 years. What are the demographics of the communities that you serve? And what are the changes that might come? And all of these, again, the challenges often are also opportunities, right? So have you thought about the challenges that might occur and what's going to happen and communicated those effectively? Step 3, analyze what kind of voices, skills, networks you need over the next 3 to 5 years. So if you don't have a strategic plan, think about it. One thing to do is to pull all that information that I just talked about over those first 3 steps, pull it together and have what a data party. Evaluators and researchers, it's a data party. It's kind of a participatory approach. Get a bunch of people together and just look at it all and talk about it and get interested in it. So that's a nice, fun way to do it and to plan for it. Yeah, what kinds of professional or educational knowledge would be helpful? You know, when you think about professionals, it's important to understand that professionals have certain areas of expertise too. I think often we think we want a lawyer on our board, and believe me, I'm not opposed to lawyers, but you do have to think about the fact that lawyers only, hey Ruby, they practice in certain areas. So if you're looking for a solicitor to have on your board and you recruit a family law lawyer, you may not get what you're looking for. So think about what kind of educational knowledge and experience and professional knowledge you're looking for. And also be thoughtful about kind of balancing your own capacity as an organization, and don't be afraid to stay small. I think that's an important thing to remember too, when you're putting all this together and you're thinking about what you need, is to say, do you need that? Do you actually need to recruit more board members? Your bylaws allow you to maybe just stay small, and maybe during times of transition, sometimes it's better to stay a little smaller. And so if you have, like some groups bylaws will say, you know, up to 12 board members, maybe this is the year you stick with 10 or 8. The minimum Societies Act allows us 3. So yeah, so that's something to think about. But what kind of values or worldview matter? Now, for some organizations, they may not feel like that matters, but like it may be like, well, that's our work isn't about values per se, but it does matter, you know, for every organization. What kind of values do you need to have, or how do you want to challenge each other in terms of maybe bringing to the board table people with different worldviews? Yeah, my goal was always to recruit board members who might have different opinion to mine, and it's not always worked for me, but I think it's important. Consider personal characteristics and lived experience, identities and affinities that you might need for good decision making. You know, it's important to, like, the concept, the disability community always talks about not about us without us. And I think that's an important thing to remember when you're recruiting for the board, is what kinds of decisions do you have to make on behalf of others, because you are making decisions on behalf of others that could benefit from a lens or an experience that you don't currently have at the board. Don't be afraid to purposefully engage differences. As I said, I think that's valuable in certain circumstances. And there's sometimes when you need to have people who have a very similar perspective in order to move the work forward because of the way it's challenging or how marginalized that community you're serving may be. You need to be very cautious and careful with that. But at the same time, I think I'm one who always thinks a good debate's worth having, because you end up with a better decision at the end of the day. And then, yeah, again, all of it needs to just be considered in light of where you're headed. So now we get down to some of the more tactical pieces. All the first 4 steps are all about kind of getting ready to ask people. The next thing to do is to actually write out job descriptions. And those job descriptions, some of the key elements, be honest. Don't hide how much time it takes and how much time your board members need to be available in order for the organization to be successful. Don't fudge that stuff, because that just makes for frustrated board members later. So be honest, be positive, put your purpose and aspiration first and the work involved second, because it's the aspirations that's going to inspire someone to get involved. But then list the work involved so that they understand what you're asking of them, and be really concrete and clear about that. But do put those aspirational pieces first, so that you can really, because that's why people get involved, frankly. It's not because of the work. Don't be afraid to talk about what they'll get out of it in the job description, to say, actually, here are the benefits, and those may depend a lot on what you're doing. And I'm not talking about like fancy dinners, because I'm sure none of you do that for your board members, but maybe they do get snacks at board meetings. So that's not something you could put that in there. That depends on your org culture, I guess, but yeah, don't be afraid to put benefits like, you get to meet and network with really amazing people, or, you get to learn more about a certain thing. You know, there's all kinds of things that they may get out of it. And maybe there's some formal training that you're going to be giving them as board members that will benefit them. They're going to get some training around to being a good board member or something like that. And then be specific, especially around the work involved. Get very specific. You will, you know, have to come to one meeting a month of 2 hours long. You'll have to do at least an hour of reading or 2 hours or more in advance, depends on the board. But I think at UBC, our last docket was at like 1,500 pages. Yeah. Anyway, okay. And then, so yeah, so these are just some of the basic elements to put in there. It's nice to include, oh, the little flowers came off the little square. They're supposed to be over there on the pink square. Yeah, just to include in there some of these kinds of things. You can also summarize this for the posting that you've put out, because the job description is a bit different than the posting is with hiring. I mean, I'm of the opinion that you treat the recruitment of volunteers the same way you would staff. So, you know, you want to be, yeah, you want to have a job description on hand that might have more in-depth information, but that the posting itself might be a lot simpler. But here are some of the key things you would want to include there. And then the next step is to post it, get it out there. You know, I'm just going to throw out a few of the postings I know about or places I know that you can post it, but I'd be interested in hearing what others. I don't know if people want to throw in the chat some places they've posted things. But Volunteer Connector is a program that's available to people. Vantage Point has Volunteer Connector now as part of their volunteer posting service, but it's also available across, like there's a number of organizations and communities all across BC that are part of Volunteer Connector. AMSA is a great place. It's the association affiliate. I always forget if it's association or affiliation of multicultural services associations. And they have a posting service that is great and goes out to any organization that's involved in multicultural, ethnic specific services. Charity Village is good. I think they're free for their volunteer postings. Yeah, Jen, you're nodding, so I think that's true. Alumni listservs is a really good place to go. And that is, if you know anybody, you know, if anybody in your current network is alumni of a particular university or department or faculty, get them to send it out on those alumni listservs. Professional associations, websites, and networks. So every kind of profession has some kind of association. For lawyers, for example, there's the Canadian Bar Association, and there's ways to get information out to the legal community through the Bar Association. But there's also like the accountants, CPA, and all the other accountants professional associations. Again, there's actually a subsection of the CPAs of Canada on nonprofit. So all accountants that work with nonprofits or participate in that. And, you know, it doesn't mean that if you work with a nonprofit in a professional as an auditor or something but most accountants I know who work with the nonprofit sector are on boards. They just can't be the auditor of that organization, that's all. Multi-language and multicultural media. There's, you know, all kinds of media outlets that are in various languages. And they're a really valuable source for volunteers of various kinds, of course, among your own members. I mean, it's amazing to me how often sometimes an organization goes off to recruit board members and doesn't even put the note out to their own members that they're looking for board members. Again, the more specific you are, the better around what you're looking for, what you need on the board in this moment in time is good. But, and again, sort of alumni from programs and services, past folks, do you have a newsletter, that kind of thing. Yeah, so, yeah, any others? LinkedIn is not bad. That's true, actually. I find LinkedIn can be pretty good. Yeah.
And I will just give a shout out that if it's a New Westminster-based society or charity and there's room, I'm happy to link to any postings in the Invest New West newsletter, which goes out twice a month to the business community, about 800 or so, 850 or so subscribers.
Awesome. That is good to know. Okay. And then Ruby, you made mention the Vancouver Foundation's neighborhood small grants, the residence committees. Ooh, that's a good idea. And any of the, I mean, you're all in New West, but some of the foundations are really good for getting stuff out there too. And the credit unions, they're really good about some of that. Yeah, and then I think that step 7 that I think we often miss when we're recruiting is outreach. So it's one thing to post it, it's quite another to do outreach, which I think of as being very specific to go out to particular people or particular communities that you're wanting to connect with and not waiting for them to come to you, hence the concept of outreach. So yeah, so I think what it is, think about, do you need an accountant? If you do, go to accounting firms that work with nonprofits, go to accounting programs at colleges and universities, alumni and professors who teach in those courses, and all kinds of different people. Do you need someone who can communicate in Punjabi? Well, that's where you go to the Focus Punjabi, Omni, the different multicultural and various kinds of language services out there, language specific communication tools out there, or a Punjabi accountant. That's a great way to ask around, start talking to your clients and members and say, look, we're looking for an accountant who also is part of the Punjabi community for various reasons. So don't be afraid to do that. You've got to reach out. Talk about who will reach out and give them the material to do that. So for example, if you have an existing staff member who works exclusively with the Cantonese speaking community and you want to recruit a Cantonese speaker to your board, then make sure you give that staff member some good tools and materials so that they can kind of get the word out for you. And then spend time in that outreach piece, just thinking a little bit about different roles people can play in that. If you want to really leverage all of the networks, then yeah, just think about, there's a staff role and a board role. I mean, it's in the staff's interest, obviously, to have a really great board, but the board also needs to take responsibility for itself in that way. It's kind of one of your obligations to ensure that you've got a good solid board going forward. So you can't rely on the staff to do that. It would be inappropriate to completely rely on staff. Your ED obviously is in the field and in the network, and so they're the one who's probably going to have the most connections in the area of work that you do. So they're key, but also, and of course the board is their boss, so it's an awkward role, but they care a lot, of course, about their board. And then step 8 is to actually interview or communicate or engage. Again, this depends a bit on who you are, but just an important message is just because they're a volunteer doesn't mean you have to accept everyone, right? So have a process for interviewing or communicating with or talking to or connecting with the person. You can have an application process, for example. Ask for writing samples if written communication is important for board members to have, that kind of thing. Talk about, ask them information about their experience, ask them about their perspectives on things, their perspective on their work. And then who should do that? This process, it so depends entirely on your organization. It's often, I've seen, it's pretty common for an ED to kind of often be the first person to reach out to potential board members. If people apply, they're often the first, they maybe the ED who kind of looks through the initial applications and shortlists, and then but the board members, some contingent of the board ought to have that conversation or be involved. It would be very inappropriate for the ED to sort of hand the board a list of here's the people to elect. It happens, but yeah, better for the board to see. It's a balance really in terms of you want to encourage a fit, but you also don't want to replicate homogeneous culture that isn't, like, if you're trying to be more diverse and inclusive as a board, then replicating yourselves is not the thing. So you want to have some processes and other networks involved than just your board members. Yeah, and then of course you have to elect them or appoint them. So there's some key questions you need to ask that you should be, the answers should be in your bylaws, but that's not always the case. It depends a bit. Some may be in policies and sometimes it just may be a practice. So think through, how do you officially appoint your board members to the board? And so one thing to ask is, who exactly are your members? Who are your legal members according to the law? And it's valuable. Things can go sideways fast if you're not clear who your members are or how they interact with how they appoint the board. Do they actually vote for them or not? That's the question, who gets to vote? Because the new Societies Act, it's not that new anymore, but it does allow for different kinds of members in your organization. And so which are the ones who get to vote when it comes to the board members? Are you a closed or open organization? So some lawyers advise nonprofits to have what's called a closed membership, which really means board members themselves are the only members. I'm not a big fan of that because I don't think it's very democratic. And the gaming, there's a couple other funders who don't like that either, because they want to see that there's more members than there are board members so that there's some sense of accountability. But legally speaking, that's perfectly acceptable. And a lot of organizations do it in order to control the organization and ensure that members don't sort of take over suddenly or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm not a fan of it. So, but it may be how it works in your organization, and that's fine. But just know which you are and who are your members exactly and who gets to vote. If you're a closed membership, then it's all very simple and straightforward, and it's not particularly complicated, which is partly why people do it. Do you have the capacity to appoint between members? If you have the standard bylaws, you probably do, and most organizations do. And if that's the case, then it becomes a bit simpler because you can appoint some members before the next AGM if you need to fill a gap. And then by the AGM, usually they have to be appointed in whatever form your bylaws allow. One thing to get a bit clear on is can you present a slate? Because it may be that your bylaws are such that there has to be an actual election on the floor on that at the AGM. On the floor just means it has to be open, and there may be nominations from the floor that are allowed or not. And you need to be clear about that, because you can go and work really hard and recruit like 4 amazing people to join your board. And then you get to an AGM and discover that some other members want other people to be on the board and not those 4 people. And so you end up with 4 people elected. It's democratic, but it's a little frustrating if you put all that effort in. So think through that and make sure you understand how that works for your organization. And then think about how you're going to manage your AGM. How you manage it really does matter in this regard, because it is a legal relationship that you're creating when you join a board. And so you need to make sure you've done it properly in order to ensure you don't have problems in the future. So, and then the last and only one is that I think a big step in recruiting board members is orienting and retaining them. For one thing, it certainly helps not having to recruit too many board members if you get to retain your board members. Again, with that slight caveat we talked about at the beginning around the value or the practice of having term limits. But having said that, you want to retain them. And so one way to retain them is to be honest in the recruitment process about the workload and the expectations, because a board member will walk pretty quickly if you haven't been honest about it, and they get in there and discover there's some huge problem that everyone knew about. And then orienting them really early and giving them the sooner you give them clarity about why you wanted them on the board and how they fit into the board and what's available to them in terms of what they could be involved in, the sooner they're going to be a useful and engaged board member. So the sooner you can do that, the better. And there's nothing more frustrating for a new board member to get all excited about in the recruitment process and all the conversations you have there, and then get to the board and they have no idea how to fit themselves into what's going on, or they're not really clear, or they didn't, there's new stuff coming. I mean, it's normal for any new board member to be a little bit unclear at first, but the sooner you can orient them, the better. Really working with the board chair, it's a key role, the board chair, in terms of ensuring there's some welcoming and inclusion. Some board chairs, have been around so long, they kind of forget that these new people need a little bit of a helping hand, a little bit of an intro, some kind of connection. And if the board chair hasn't been involved in recruitment, which sometimes they aren't because the governance committee is more involved or something like that, then you want to just make sure your board chair is thinking about that role. And then I really believe that you also want to create some kind of fun, like some kind of, reality. This is a volunteer role with a lot of responsibility. And you want them to really feel connected and to feel like it's been a really valuable thing for them. And I believe in feeding people, so I always think food is good. But with Zoom, of course, that hasn't been particularly easy. So yeah, so those are my, oh wait, no, I have one more. Oh yeah, one good practice for keeping people involved, and that is some evaluation or self-assessment of some kind. So there's a various tools or ways to do that, but that'll keep board members quite a long time too, if you give them an opportunity to continue to improve the board and improve the opportunities. So yeah, so those are my 10 things, and that's my last slide. And maybe I'll leave it there and open it up for questions. Should I stop sharing now?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you stop share, and that way, if anyone does want to hop on, they're welcome to do so. And oh, someone's just entered. There we go. But thank you, Alison. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. I got some good tips there for a few of the things that I'm working on. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, dive in. Really?
Oh. Go ahead, Ruby.
Hi, you knew I would be good for something, hey? I apologize, I'm a little late. Anyway, and so you may have addressed this earlier on. So I'm struggling on one board where we are trying to create a culture of fundraising, right?
Mm.
So we're trying to diversify from all of our government fundraising grants and recognizing that that may end at some point, and just diversify our organization that's been around for over 50 years. So this is very new. And so some of the board members are reluctant to donate. And so we're having a conversation around, it doesn't matter what level, we just kind of feel like it's important to contribute, and we're just socializing it. We're not giving them a hard date, right? But it's a lot of resistance. Some people are saying, well, I'm volunteering my time. Isn't that enough?
Yeah.
So what's your thoughts on that? Like thank you.
It's very common. I think part of that is around making sure you're clear in the recruitment process around any expectations there, so that they can't get away with saying no once they're on the board. But I mean, I think it's important to be thoughtful about the donation piece from a sort of Jedi lens and perspective around making it a mandatory expectation, because I think that can create a sense of barrier. Even though, we all know, if you've done any fundraising, that, it's middle income people who are giving all the money. So there's that. But I think it's very normal for people to say, oh my God, I'm giving so much time and you expect me to donate at the same time. But part of the argument is that you as a board member, you're the uber supporter of this organization. Like, you represent the most engaged, intense supporter of the agency. And as such, you should be a donor as well. Like, that's a part of it. That's a part of being a supporter and showing that you support the organization. And money matters. Having said that, I've worked with board members who are like that, and they say I don't want to give. And what I found always works, and you probably know this, but is talking about fund development in a broader sense. It's not about asking your friend for money. It's never about that, right? And so you need your board. Your board has a responsibility to ensure the financial sustainability of the organization. That is actually one of their jobs, one of their responsibilities. And so as such, they need to be thinking strategically about how to do that. And so there's ways to contribute to that fund development effort that may not be about money. And the more that you engage them in that, the more they understand how fund development works, the less resistant they are to actually donating themselves. So I think there's, and it is, one of my favorite experiences, it was at West Coast Leaf, and lawyers are notorious for being like, I don't want to donate because I give too much time. And it's like, you're lawyers, come on, you can give money, which isn't totally true. There's lots of very low income lawyers out there in the world, but not in the Lower Mainland. Anyway, but yeah, she refused to donate money because she felt so, and she did give, she gave time beyond the board to, she gave legal advice. She did all kinds of things for the organization. So, she was right in that she gave so much. but she also insisted she wasn't going to participate in fundraising at all in any way, that was just not her thing. And she never wanted to have anything to do with it. And it was about 3 years later when she was in opening a big giant fundraising event as the kind of MC. And she's 2 sentences in and she says, and you all should be donating to the organization. I donate, it's really important. So give your money now. And she just asked like 500 people to give money. So, you can get people there. I think it's just giving them options for their involvement with revenue development. It isn't just about asking a friend for money or giving money themselves. And eventually they figure it out. But if the organization's never done fundraising before, I'm not surprised that it's going to take some time for that kind of a culture shift. Yeah.
No, that's helpful, tying it especially to the fiscal responsibility that board members have. Yeah. Thanks, Alison.
Yeah. It's all, it's easier. The best argument is always if you're going to ask somebody for money and you don't donate, it's just weird. So, yeah.
I've got a question if no one else is going to jump in. So one of the people who actually requested this session, this was the question she posed to me. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it tonight, but she'll watch the recording, so that's why I'm asking it.
Okay.
But she said she's really struggling with recruiting for the treasurer position specifically. So her organization had someone who acted as the treasurer for many, many years, eventually made the decision to retire, which was fine, put in place some systems, with bookkeeping and accounting and that kind of stuff. But the treasurer position has just remained, this really, really difficult position to recruit for. And she asked me if one of the things we could look at was tips on recruiting for specific positions and skill sets, and how she can kind of make a person not feel quite so worried about what potential responsibilities they may have.
Well, one of the arguments for having term limits is that when, and I've seen this mostly in that treasurer role, is that people they get used to taking care of a bunch of stuff. And so when the next person comes along, they look at all the things the last treasurer was taking care of and think, I can't possibly do that. So I can't volunteer because, oh my gosh. So I do think that the key would be to show that there are financial systems and processes that are in place and policies in place that it's being taken, like the treasurer doesn't have to be the bookkeeper or the accountant. They're there to provide that liaison between the board and the financials to make sure the board understands them and stuff. And that's their actual role. I also think you don't need an accountant in that role. Sometimes we think we do, but you do need someone who's managed budgets and managed money. But you don't need someone who's been an accountant. In fact, sometimes there's an advantage to having someone who thinks a little bit outside the accounting box, thinking about the money. But I do think that, depending on what other supports are there for that person in that role, that's one of those situations where you might want to go to the accounting schools and the accounting programs at there's so many universities and colleges in the Lower Mainland. And a lot of them have accounting and bookkeeping programs and things like that, and actively recruiting among their senior students, or someone who's just about to graduate, or even one of their professors or academics. I think we think about the accounting firms, but in fact, there's all kinds of people who know tons about financial management in the education sector. But that's another one too, to go to the local credit unions. Their staff often are looking for volunteer opportunities. TELUS in terms of their staff, like some of the corporations that actually encourage their staff to volunteer, they're full of accountants and full of financial people. So it's sometimes a good place to go for that too. Like I had a board member who worked at Best Buy, and Best Buy actually had a donation matching program. If their staff volunteered, they would donate money in sort of match the number of hours the person put in. So that's a great place to go for those too. But I think the key is, as you say, Amy, it doesn't have to be an accountant. It just has to be someone who really understands budgets, financial statements, money. And there's lots of people out there who aren't accountants.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Go ahead, Eleanor.
Hi. The job descriptions and should fundraising be part of the job description, or would it be implied? Because right now, from what I've seen with the organization I'm in right now, it's hard reaching out to the board of directors and telling them that they have to assist in the fundraising.
Well, I think it's worth explaining. If you, so there's fundraising and there's revenue development. And I think when you talk about revenue development, it's a little easier to take, because when it's the minute you use language around fundraising, people think you mean asking for donations. Like the board is responsible for ensuring the financial well-being of the organization, but that could play out in a variety of ways. And so I think, well, put it this way, to answer your specific question, yes, it should be in the job description if you have an expectation of them to be involved directly in fundraising. That means donor interactions, asking for money from individuals. So if you have that expectation of them, it should show up in the job description. If you have an expectation they donate, it should show up in the job description. If you should have those things, period, that's again something you need to like make a conscious decision as an organization, as a board. Do we need our board members to donate? If we do, let's put it in the job description. If we don't, but we require them to participate in revenue development in some way, that could show up in a variety of ways for different people. So it could be helping put grant proposals together, helping find grant funders, helping engage, build a silent auction event online. It could be like, there could be all kinds of ways they do it, but really a board should be strategically thinking about the money. And, Ruby's point about an organization that's very dependent on government funding, it's in their interest in the long run to consider other kinds of fund development work and getting funding from other places, whether it's earned income or donors or grants or what have you. But, and so depending on where you're at as an organization, you want to recruit people who can contribute to that financial well-being. Like you may have a board that already does enough fundraising, and that's fine. So what you need actually are people who understand social enterprise and earned income, because maybe you've got a great business opportunity you're not taking up because no one in the organization, everyone's a bit nervous about the idea of business and getting into that. So yeah. So the answer to your question is yes, it should be there if it's there. Does it have to be there? I don't know. That would be up to you guys. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks, Amy, for putting that in the chat.
Yeah.
Canada College Vancouver with a course and a link there for students looking for work experience. So there's an opportunity there as well.
Another place to go to recruit, actually, we can't all do it because there's only so many people, but Mosaic started a really great program, a civil engagement program that I helped teach at last round. I don't know if they're doing it again this fall, but and part of it was to train new immigrants who have professionals accreditations from outside of Canada who aren't working in that field here, but who are interested in being engaged in community and in leadership and so boards is a really great place for those people to be able to connect and participate. So yeah, I mean, there's some amazing people who are accountants, but aren't allowed to practice here because they got their accountant degree in, Thailand or something, and Canada, BC is not accepting it. So, so there's lots of amazing people like that. And again, you can find really just deeply dedicated people who have all the skills. It's just that for other reasons, they're not necessarily connected to the same networks. Yeah.
I have another question. How far in advance should you be recruiting? What kind of a timeline are we looking at for this sort of process?
That's a good question. Well, I hate to tell you this, but I think it's a constant process. Most boards should have kind of a governance committee or a nominating committee of some kind. Your bylaws may actually require you to have a nominating committee. They often do. But it's kind of a constant process. And again, it's around thinking about engagement. And so, it's good to keep a little chart of your board members and when their term might be up or when they might be leaving, and have a sense, whether it's the board chair, the nominating committee, or the ED who keeps track of it. But just to have your mind's eye on when you might be needing new board members. And sometimes you lose people for reasons that are not, they're not organized around time. But frankly, the best scenario is to have a couple of people in mind at any given moment. And so that's why having sort of generic board job descriptions available and accessible to everyone in the organization at any time, because they could run across someone who's really interested in getting engaged and would be a good board member, then you could move into some recruitment right away. Yeah. So I think it's kind of an ongoing thing. Having said that, everything else depends a bit on your organization, like how big are you, how complicated are you, how networked are you, that kind of stuff. Because the 10 steps I describe here, you could do all those in one day if your organization, well, you couldn't quite do it all in one day because you got to elect people and orient them and stuff, but most of it could be done in one day.
Sorry, Alison,
Mhm.
did I hear you correctly that, as you said, yes, I agree that it is an ongoing effort,
Mhm.
but once you find them, you can invite them into the group but not entirely as a elected board member, but they can sit there and get involved. And then the next election, then we can formally elect them as part of that members. Yes.
Well, actually, most boards, you can actually appoint someone to be a full board member between AGMs. Like
Oh,
the
okay.
standard bylaws usually allow a board. So usually it's because you've got a gap. So let's say your bylaws say you can have 10, you should have 10 board members, and someone leaves partway through the year. Most standard bylaws allow you to actually appoint a full board member in between in that scenario. So you'd need to check that. But I mean, it's up to your board as to whether you could invite people to come to your board and participate in discussions and participate in the agenda, unless there's something private about people's incomes or something. There's things you got to be confidential about, but it's actually good practice to invite a potential board member to at least one board meeting before they join, so that all the board members get to meet them and they can see the board in action and kind of assess out whether they really do feel like that's the board they want to join, and they can participate. You just have to be a bit thoughtful about whether there's conversations happening that might be confidential, but no, you
Good
should
to know.
Yeah, you should be able to appoint someone in between, and then you just need to have them ratified or present them for election at the next AGM. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison.
You're welcome.
There's a couple of other questions. So Amy had another question about people from sort of outside the jurisdiction. And do you have any sort of thoughts about people who want to join the board that are from outside the jurisdiction that you serve?
It depends a lot on the organization, but especially now with our virtual universes, you can have people on your board who are not living next door. There's nothing legally wrong with having somebody outside the area that you work in. I mean, we have members of parliament who represent ridings they don't live in. You can do it. I guess the question would be, why would you recruit someone who isn't part of your local community? And maybe it's because they have professional or other skills or other knowledge that you need, that you haven't recruited here. Or is it necessary to be connected to your physical community that you're in? For lots of organizations, it's not, right?
Yeah. In our case, Alison, this is just me thinking out loud. In our case, because of COVID-19, it opens up the market for us, meaning, participants, because now we are living online. So we are actually serving people from across the globe. We have our team in India, and and Spain and Mexico and in the UK and the US. So we have this broad, all of a sudden we become an instant global organization in less than a year.
Wow.
And we're not asking for it. We didn't ask for
Yeah.
this. And so now we're and then people love what we do, and they come to us and say, hey, we'd like to join, and what can we do? And so
Yeah.
so we're putting them in different area, but I keep thinking, as we are growing, as we are also building people's community in their area, it would be really cool to have these people that are engaged with us, and then there is that similarity and familiarity.
Mhm.
That's why we're thinking of why if this is possible.
Well, I guess the caution would simply be that I know that the Societies Act requires people to be eligible to be board members, and so if you're registered as a BC nonprofit, then what you would have to do is ensure that you have a minimum number of board members. And I think BC residency is one of the requirements, but
Yeah.
I'm not positive about that, but I'm pretty sure it is. So you need to have at least a minimum number who fit that category, because the laws that are going to apply to the organization, like employment laws and stuff, I mean, it depends. If you're hiring people in India, then Indian employment laws apply, not BC laws. But there's certain, because you're physically here in BC and you're registered in BC, there's certain BC laws that apply. And so you need to have a certain number that are BC residents.
Mm-hmm.
But you can define the board. You can amend your bylaws to allow, for example, 5 BC board members, and then, well, I don't know if you can do this. You'd have to check with a lawyer who does this work, but, and 10 board members from anywhere. So that you have the core 5 that's more than the 3 minimum of the Societies Act that are BC residents. And then the rest, and there may just be some logistics or legal kind of gymnastics you need to do around certain kinds of motions that are required that ensure that those 5 BC residents are the ones that are in support. But
I'm thinking of this, Alison, because we're planning to apply as a federal society.
That changed.
So this,
then,
yeah. So that's why I'm kind of thinking ways to be creative and but yet doing it legally.
Yeah. I think when you're registering federally is different, because most of the international organizations out there like Oxfam and Save the Children and stuff are federally registered, and so there's different expectations around how their boards might work. There's still some residential requirements to some degree, I think, but I think it's different. So yeah. And I see Anka. Oh, she's in the waiting room. Oh, there. She had a question around, she has a cold, poor thing. What about recruitment outside of the standard positions, i.e. member at large? Well, I think for member at large, I think what you want to think about is the first few steps I talked about around what do you need for your board? What are your strengths? Where are the gaps? What are the challenges coming? And what are the kind of representations or perspectives or worldviews or personal life experiences that you want on your board, and ensure that you're recruiting to those. So member at large doesn't necessarily mean it's just a generic person from the membership. What it means is that it just isn't an executive member of your board. So it's not the treasurer, the vice chair, the chair. And so I would say that when you're recruiting there, you still want to do all the work of thinking through what do you need for the board. But the job description may be a bit simpler or less specific than it would be for a particular position. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions around the different positions? There's the treasurer, which is probably the hardest. And the board chair, it can be hard to, you need someone who's been on your board for a bit usually, or you want someone who's been on your board. But you do need to be thoughtful about succession planning when it comes to the board chair. So that's partly what the vice chair role is supposed to be. They take on some of the tasks related to being chair, but they should be the person who's going to take over as chair when that person moves on. And you want to give them some facilitation training, I think. Too many board chairs take over and they don't know how to facilitate a meeting well. So yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, I'll end the recording and we can all leave at our leisure. All right. Well, seeing none, I'm going to stop recording.